Now, a different kind of intellectual arrogance can come from developmental considerations. This comes from research showing that, in general, young children have a rose-colored bias about their futures. This was initially studied for traits and abilities, not for knowledge and intellectual skills. So, for example, if you describe to children a very young child who has shorter than average height or much poorer than average athleticism, is quite clumsy or is very messy, and then you ask them about their future, what that person will be like when they're grown up, young children tend to think that the sky's the limit. They think this far below average person can become much taller than average, much more athletic than average, or much neater than average. And this effect seems to have it's argued to have a potentially adaptive role, what's called protective optimism. The idea is that young children are so confronted with their failures all the time, because they are often very much at the beginning part of a learning curve, that they might give up if they didn't have almost irrational expectations about future success. The idea here is that it protects them from failure and makes them keep persisting when they're doing so badly early on. This kind of developmental overoptimism bias for traits and abilities exists across cultures. It's been found in Japan and China and several other cultures. And it declines with age, so it's much stronger in younger children. And we can see that in the following graph. So in the classic study along these lines, if you look at this graph and look at the leftmost panel, the 5 to 6-year-olds, you'll see that when thinking about what an adult will be like who is shorter than average or less athletic average or really messy, they nonetheless think that that person will be extreme positive change. So that yellow bar in that leftmost panel means that the 5 and 6-year-olds are judging that child when they grow up to having very strong positive traits, having switched from being below average to being way above average. By the time they're 7 or 8 years of age, it's more mixed. Kids tend to think that a person will move to a medium level of competence, average levels of performance, so they'll get much better than being below average, but they won't be at peak performance. But then it changes rather radically with adults. Adults consider the poor individual who's below average in all these traits to stay stuck in the below average part of the continuum on into adulthood. They see consistency in the traits and not this positive change. So they don't have developmental overoptimism at all. If anything, they have almost a pessimism. So that's for traits and abilities. The question is whether this effect extends to knowledge. And could that cause intellectual arrogance? This might be different. It might not be the case that it works for knowledge, given the fact that young children often defer more to adults. So there's a pretty rich literature showing that young children tend, when they hear adults tell them things, to agree with what the adults tell them to a larger extent than older children or adults. If they're so deferential, perhaps they're not very optimistic about future knowledge as opposed to they are about future abilities. Well, to test this, we had them engage in a future knowledge task, where participants received 10 knowledge items to evaluate about what others might know at age 35, and also what the self might know at age 35. We also had them evaluate knowledge at age 5 to look at the contrast. 2 items each were asked about in various domains: knowledge of complex artifacts, knowledge of biological processes, knowledge of natural phenomena, knowledge of psychological phenomena, and moral knowledge. We did this so as to get a sense of whether this intellectual over-optimism pervaded across all domains or was somehow restricted to some content areas as opposed to others. For complex artifacts, one example would be, how much do you think John, say at age 35, will know about the inside parts that make up helicopters and how they work to make helicopters fly? For biological processes, it might be, how much do you think that Tony knows when he's 35 about all the parts that make up trees and leaves and how they work to make leaves change colors in the fall? For natural phenomena, the question might be, how much do you think that Bill knows about the parts that make up thunder and lightning storms and how those parts make thunder and lightning storms happen? For psychological phenomena, it might be, how much do you think that Dana knows about why some children are better liked than others and have more friends? And finally, for moral knowledge, it might be, how much do you think Mary knows about when it's wrong to ask other people take other people's things without asking, and why that's wrong? When you do that task with adults, and this is a complicated graph, so we'll go through it slowly, as seen here in Figure 1, people's judgments of others' knowledge at age 35 shows the same kind of effect we found for physical traits and attributes. Look at the leftmost panel, which is knowledge of artifacts, and you'll see that the 5 and 7-year-olds, which is the leftmost bar, think that people will know an extraordinary amount about helicopter flies. This is judging someone else's knowledge. Older children are an intermediate value, but then adults think, no, they won't know very much at all. That's complicated, they won't grasp it. Then if you look for the next one over, which is knowledge of natural kinds, that is to say of thunderstorms or earthquakes and things like that, you find again this inflated knowledge early on, and then the knowledge gets less and less with time. The same thing is true for biology, the next panel over, and for psychology, although there tends to be somewhat more optimism about what people will know at all ages. Now, moral knowledge is different. Here, there's no developmental trend because everyone at all ages thought that moral understanding and knowledge would be automatic, does not require a whole lot of learning. It's something that comes in perhaps more instinctually. This is knowledge at age 35 of others. If you ask children and adults to rate their own knowledge at age 35 in the same domains, you get essentially the same effect, except that it's more inflated. So there's some degree of self-enhancement going on. Notice that the bar for the somewhat middle-aged children is the white bar is higher than it was in the prior slide. So you still see the developmental effect, but the children tend to persist somewhat longer at being over-optimistic about their own future self-knowledge. Again, the moral knowledge is right at the ceiling effect. So what we see is that for judgments of one's future knowledge, whether it's one's own or peers, children are wildly over-optimistic, and this can be seen as a form of intellectual arrogance. But is it really intellectual arrogance? They clearly think they'll know a great deal more at age 35 as well as at age 5, but does that have the same flavor as normal adult intellectual arrogance? And we might suggest that it does not. It seems perhaps to be something closer to intellectual exuberance, a great deal of excitement and over-optimism about where one could be, but less of a feeling of social comparison of being better than others. While there's somewhat of a small effect of rating themselves higher, the important thing to note is they rate other people very highly as well. So we can think of this as having just a feeling of incredible knowledge potential for everyone, far more than seems actually appropriate to older children and adults.